Chapter 39 is looking at the 1970s, all of these changes going on with the end of the Vietnam War, the Richard Nixon administration, Watergate, etc. Now, to begin with, remember, Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968, and really for the first time around 1967 to about 1973, we're seeing a decrease in the economy from after World War II was over. Productivity was slowing down, income levels were slowing down, and so we did start to see during this period of time a decrease in the standard of living. This type of an economy is now referred to as stagflation, combining a stagnant economy and then inflation going on. This is also occurring with high unemployment. So Nixon tries tax cuts, he tries budget cuts. None of this really has the effect that he is hoping it will have. Now, reasons economists say this stagflation occurred. The Great Society programs, Vietnam, are costing us billions of dollars. High deficit spending is adding to this inflation. Also, we're starting to lose out on the international trading market. Japan and West Germany, who obviously we rebuilt after World War II, is up and running. Their industrial productivity is actually starting to outpace the United States. They are now our competition. There are not enough jobs available to go around. A large labor market. Remember, this is the era that the baby boomers are coming of age and looking for jobs, and there aren't the jobs available in order to supply for all these people. Also adding to this was the embargo that OPEC placed on oil. OPEC is a cartel of oil-producing companies. This is the Organization of Petroleum-Producing Countries, mainly in the Middle East, some South American countries as well. They were mad at us for the U.S.'s support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, and so they cut back on the amount of oil that was available to the United States pretty much as punishment. They're going to do this again in the late 1970s as well. And then finally, we've been talking about this, that shift to a post-industrial society, moving away from industry more towards a service-based economy is really affecting our economic health. And so Nixon does take us finally off the gold standard for good in order to allow for more fluctuation with our currency. Now, looking at the war in Vietnam, remember Nixon had promoted a peace with honor strategy to not cut and run, to not leave our allies, the South Vietnamese government, behind. And so his plan in order to do this is known as Vietnamization, to slowly start scaling back American involvement in this war and start pushing the South Vietnamese forward. So what started out as a civil war between the North and South, the United States had come in and pretty much taken over war operations. Now we are starting to scale back to allow the Vietnamese to fight their own war so that we can have peace with honor. And this is exactly what he did. From 1969 to 1971, the number of troops went down from over 500,000 people to about 25,000 in country. This was extremely popular among the silent majority. The silent majority, these are your regular middle-class citizens. They're not the vocal anti-war protesters. They are your regular pool and patio types that aren't necessarily looking to stay in Vietnam forever, but they want to have a peace with honor. So this was very popular among them. However, several things are about to happen during Nixon's administration that are going to force the American people to continue to question the credibility of our government. First and foremost, the My Lai massacre. In 1968, an American platoon led by Lieutenant William Calley was on a search and destroy mission looking for Viet Cong. They had been told there were Viet Cong in a nearby hamlet or village known as My Lai. They went there looking for Viet Cong. Whether or not they were hiding there or not is not the issue. They were so outraged by not finding the Viet Cong there, like they thought, that they gathered all the villagers together and murdered and raped them. In total, 560 men, women, and children were massacred by American soldiers. Only one helicopter pilot actually tried to stop this massacre. Now, the reason this becomes a major issue, aside from the fact that we have American troops murdering innocent civilians in Vietnam, is that this didn't become public knowledge until 1969. This was covered up at the highest levels within the U.S. military, but the New York Times broke this story, and obviously this created outrage among the American people. In the end, Lieutenant Calley was actually convicted of murder. However, his sentence was later reduced to house arrest. And the rest of the troops said that they were just following orders. Remember, that's the same excuse the Nazis gave at Nuremberg. But an interesting quote from this, John Kerry, who ran for president in 2004 and is Secretary of State, he had served in Vietnam. He also came home from the war and became an active participant in the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He called My Lai in a congressional hearing not isolated incidents, but crimes committed on a daily basis with the full awareness of officers at all levels of command. The American people have turned against Vietnam. They have soured on this, and this is just one more thing to add to that. And so another thing that is going to turn the American people against this war. In 1970, Nixon, it comes out that Nixon had ordered secret bombing raids into Cambodia and also Laos the year before. This was done without the knowledge of the American people and without the knowledge of Congress as well. He is using those war-making powers that are so beyond extravagant that no president has ever had this level of power. Many people say that Nixon felt he was above the law and he was an imperial president, that he didn't need to answer to anyone, that those checks and balances are absolutely gone. The invasion into Cambodia is obviously much harder to keep under wraps because it's using a whole lot of manpower. And so as a direct result of this, riots broke out all across the United States on college campuses. The one that is obviously most well known is the riot that broke out on Kent State University's campus, obviously in Ohio, on May 4th, 1970. This is a several-day riot. Protesters burned the ROTC building down. The mayor called in the National Guard to restore law and order. In the chaos of the following days, the National Guard fired into the crowd of unarmed protesters who were throwing rocks, bottles, etc. And in the end, 9 were wounded at Kent State and 4 were killed. Obviously, this is immortalized in the famous song Ohio by Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young. Also, this happens at Jackson State University on May 14th, 1970 as well. Here, 12 were wounded, 2 were dead. And after this, college campuses across the United States shut down. Kids were ordered to go home immediately. Here you see these are images from the My Lai massacre that came out in the New York Times. The National Guard on the campus at Kent State University. Obviously, the most famous photo from this attack, obviously, this girl's kneeling at the body of one of the dead. So, because of Nixon's actions into Cambodia, Congress realizes, hey, we've given the president way too much power. And so directly related to that, and especially since now Americans are starting to say this is a terrible idea that we were ever involved in this war, Congress actually repealed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, trying to take back their war-making powers. They're going to do some stuff later on as well to continue that precedent. In 1971, adding to that credibility gap, the New York Times released information. These were leaked pages from the Pentagon. Remember, the Pentagon is where our military base is. This was a 7,000-page document that was supposed to stay internal. And basically what the Pentagon paper said was that from the very beginning, LBJ had plans to enter this war long before the attack on the USS Maddox at the Gulf of Tonkin. In fact, he'd written the Tonkin Gulf Resolution before it, and he was only waiting for the opportune moment to get involved in this war. The Pentagon papers also said that there was no plan to end this war as long as the North was constantly trying to reunite with the South. There was no exit strategy. And so the Pentagon papers show the government has been lying to us. We bought into their propaganda. This is not the truth. Also, 1971 marks the passage of the 26th Amendment. 18-year-olds are now allowed to vote. One of the major concerns had been 18 to 20-year-olds are being drafted into this war, and yet they can't vote out of office. Those men and women are obviously putting them there. So let's take a look at other areas when it comes to the Cold War. A policy of détente. Détente means to ease Cold War tensions, to move away from brinkmanship. The Secretary of State at this time was Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger promoted a policy of realpolitik, or realistic politics. He says, we have to deal with countries realistically, especially communist countries like China. The United States, up until this point, had not recognized China as an official government. We basically were closing our eyes and pretending they didn't exist. He said that's absolutely ridiculous. This is a huge country. They've been around for years. We need to deal with them realistically. He wanted to open China up. There's a lot of trade options available by working with the Chinese government, even if they are communist. And so together, Kissinger and Nixon really promoted this idea of realpolitik and détente, not only opening up China to trade, which happened in 1972, which obviously still exists today, but also trying to ease Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union. In 1972, Nixon also met with Leonid Brezhnev as the leader of the Soviet Union to try to ease Cold War tensions by passing the SALT I Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. This would limit our ICBMs, our intercontinental ballistic missiles, for 5 years' time. They also passed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty to limit our defensive missiles. And all of this is being done in order to ease those Cold War tensions. Here's Nixon meeting with Chairman Mao in China. Okay, so let's talk about the Supreme Court now. Remember, the Warren Court has been around for forever. Earl Warren was named as Chief Justice by Eisenhower, and this is actually the court that presided over the Brown versus Board decision. The Warren Court, as it's known, is probably the most liberal Supreme Court we have ever had in our history, and they're very focused on judicial activism, using their power from the Supreme Court bench to make changes to society. So where Congress is failing in their eyes, they're going to step up and make changes to society. This is obviously going to anger conservative Nixon a whole lot. So several court cases that are really important from the Warren Commission. First and foremost, 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut. This law struck down a Connecticut law banning birth control, even between married couples. And this is establishing, they say, a right to privacy, that our founding fathers might not have written it into the Constitution that you have a right to privacy, but they obviously meant it. This is focusing on those implied powers. This right to privacy precedent that is established in Griswold versus Connecticut is later going to be extended to the Roe versus Wade decision, which is obviously what allows women to have abortions. New York Times versus Sullivan, 1964. You can only sue for libel against a paper if you can prove malicious intent. So I can't sue a newspaper for libel, meaning lying about me, unless I can prove they meant some maliciousness involved. So this expands our freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Baker versus Carr, 1962, establishes a one-person, one-vote mentality. State governments had been redrawing their district lines in very bizarre ways in order to keep their party in office. So very random drawings of the electoral map in order to disenfranchise, essentially, people in the opposing political party. This is saying that every person has the right to equal representation. This is electoral reform, trying to get rid of what is known as gerrymandering, that random drawing of the electoral lines, one person, one vote. Also, other court cases are focusing on limiting religion in schools, that separation of church and state idea. We see rights for the accused with Miranda versus Arizona, that the Warren Court basically says that all accused people must be made aware of their rights, and hence the Miranda warning. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say will be used against you in a court of law, blah, 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 blah. All that was established in order to protect the rights of the accused. So Nixon, who was a conservative, very angry at this judicial activism, tried to modify the court when his time came, when he was able to appoint 4 new conservative justices, including Warren Burger as the new Chief Justice. However, even though he was trying to turn the court more conservative, that didn't necessarily work, because under the Burger Court, they actually made their decision in Roe versus Wade, granting women the right to an abortion because it falls in line with that right to privacy. Okay, some other things going on at this time. Specifically focusing on the environmental movement, that our focus cannot always be on helping business, it's also got to be on helping the environment. This has really jump-started in 1962 when Rachel Carson wrote a very influential book known as Silent Spring. Basically, she said that the use of DDT, which is a chemical pesticide, was destroying our environment, that birds were eating up these DDT-filled bugs, and then they were going to die off, and it was going to have a terrible terrible effect on our ecosystem. So she said that eventually we would have a silent spring because all the birds would be dead. This really starts to open up people's eyes to environmentalism as a real phenomenon. Also in 1970, Congress created the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, to make sure that businesses are meeting the requirements for environmental issues. Also the Clean Air Act of 1960 and the Endangered Species Act of 1973 to protect certain animals that are now considered endangered. All right, let's go to 1972. Nixon is running for re-election, and even though there are a lot of issues to deal with Nixon, for example, the expansion into Cambodia, et cetera, right on the eve of this election, where he is running against the Democrat George McGovern, Nixon's Secretary of State Kissinger says that peace is at hand, that any day now he expects peace with North Vietnam. He is also utilizing his Southern strategy to win, luring those conservative Southerners away from the Democratic Party. Remember, the Democratic Party is no longer the party that the South once started, buying into. So the Solid South doesn't work anymore. So with this, Nixon wins an overwhelming landslide victory in 1972. 520 electoral votes to 17. And as much as was said about those 18-year-olds voting, only half of those 18 to 21-year-olds actually registered to vote, which is obviously still true today. Take a look here at the electoral map for 1972.